but the global language of bees. So as I was preparing for this, I was thinking to myself, global language, which way could I go? And there's so many ways, and how do you make it global and all that sort of thing. But the idea is bees are pretty much global, minus like Antarctica, right, in the Arctic. So they're kind of everywhere. But we really wanted to focus on the language side and what it means to have language. And, you would think it'd be easy to define what language is. But when organisms are doing all kinds of weird things out there in nature, it gets a little tricky. So we'll start there, and then we'll move forward to some specific details of what bees do. And then we'll talk a little bit more generally about other global languages that the bees speak that we might also learn to speak. So what is language? I found this really cool graphic online. It's got all these languages and their relative position in space where they're spoken, and it's kind of shaped in the terrestrial part of the planet. Kind of interesting. I have no idea why some of them are gray, or parts of them are gray and some of them are blue, but pretty cool, and dominant spoken language and all that kind of stuff. And I think when most people see this, they recognize that those are pretty much all languages. But when they see this, a bee shaking its abdomen, they may not think of language immediately. So what we want to do is make sure that we allow ourselves to potentially see other forms of language out there. And so what is language? My mentor, an old guy from Germany, Rudolf Yonder, would always tell me, whatever we define it to be. What is anything? It is truly whatever we define it to be. And one of the most important things to understand is that all words are made up at some point in history, right? Someone had to come up with the gesture to say these symbolic vibrations of sound are going to mean this specific concept. And one of the things that's really important about trying to understand and discovering things about reality is that if your concepts are rigid, you're not going to find those things out there very easily. If your concepts are a little more fluid, it's a little more approachable. And specifically for insects, the prevailing theories of people who are not insect trained is they're not that smart, they don't have that many skills. So if you go in with a mindset of that, you're not going to look for complexity. So part of this is making sure we relieve ourselves from potential constraints. So what is language, right? The concepts, the words are made up, the concepts they represent can be more or less inclusive. And we have to be, conscious of this. So how have we, and of course we're going to use the English language, how have we chosen to define language? Has it been elitist? Is it possible that we've constrained ourselves to a boundary that makes it somewhat informative, but could be more informative? So I go to the Oxford definition. And there's 3, so we'll go through each one. Oxford definition, number 1, of language is the method of human communication, either spoken or written, consisting of the use of words in a structured and conventional way. Now, clearly, honeybees cannot have this kind of language because they're not human. That's a kind of restrictive concept, right? And a way to define it, which is totally fine, okay? So honeybees will never have language because they're not human. Another way to define it is the style of a piece of writing or speech. Well, honeybees don't write or speak, so they're kind of not going to be classified there at all. And the last, a system of communication used by a particular country or community. I wouldn't say that honeybees have countries. They kind of have communities, but I don't think it's implied the same way in this definition. And the question to me was, are all systems of communication actually language? And I'm not sure I agree with that. So I want to kind of wrap our minds around this idea of what is language before we begin to look at the behavior. Because we're very convinced that humans have language. So when we see behavior that we call language, it's easy to say, oh, that's language, right? When we see behaviors of other organisms, it may not be so easy for us to see the language in the behavior. So, language in animal behavior, what if we decided to remove the constraints? What if we said, you don't have to be human. Just because we're human, we have language. That's not a great definition. We don't need to be exclusive, right? What if we decided you didn't have to write and speak? What if we decided proof of language didn't require countries or communities, right? What's behind all of that? what's left over when we say these constraints are not necessary? Because for sure, humans are not language, right? There's something that predates that. There's something that comes before that. And so what's the commonality? Is there commonality, right? What do we have left over? If what we have left over from what communication is and what humans do that we call language, if we strip those constraints away, by far, we still can acknowledge that human language is the most complex. There's no other example in biology that comes even close. If you think about how complex human language is, we can talk about things that don't even exist. And then we can talk about how those things that don't exist interact with other things that don't exist. If you've ever been on Facebook, you know what I'm saying? And people get so up in arms. We're so deep in this abstract artificial world that reality doesn't even have to even come close. In fact, some people are more attached to their artificial reality avatars than they are to some of their own in real life things. IRL, in real life. If we leave behind those constraints, we might actually see many other forms of life as possessing language. So we'll dig into some of that. Now, if we think about the basics, the mechanics, what does it mean when humans are doing language, speaking, writing, and so forth and so on? We're going to take speaking as an example. It's a mechanistic thing. From an animal behavior point of view, this is what we could observe. If we were not human, this is what we would observe in this animal, this human animal, okay? We would detect that in all communications, you have to have a sender of communication, a sender of information. That sender has a voice box. Nice little anatomical diagram here. If you've ever got to see one in real life, it's really kind of nondescript. It's kind of like a couple slits in the middle of your throat and some slightly thicker pieces of tissue, but obviously surrounded by a complex set of muscles and such. That voice box gets to be vibrated. As the voice box vibrates, it generates vibrations in the air, which we call sound. That information is traveling through the medium of the atmosphere, of air. That signal, which contains the information, is detected by vibrations in the fluid, right, of the inner ear, in the cochlea. But the language doesn't actually happen until the brain takes a hold of those vibrations and says, aha, this portion of the sound we're receiving, we're talking about language for that. Because if I do this, would we consider that language? If I crumpled up a piece of newspaper, you would hear it. It's still sound. It's still the same stimulus. But is that actually language? Language actually happens in the brain. It's a processing thing, and it's an emergent property of combining wavelengths and frequencies and durations and so forth and so on. So, symbol decoding in the brain. This is where language is derived from simple stimuli. And when we look at other species, now we can look at this magnificent bee, which we're going to talk about honeybees first, and say, what have humans called language in bees before? And is it really language, right? Well, we can view a behavior called the vibration of the abdomen and strutting around, walking. That's how the sender is going to send the information. That walking pattern in physical space is the medium by which that information is going to be moved from one individual to the next. And the attending bees watching the dance actually have to follow the motions to receive the information. So whether it's sound vibrations and cochlea vibrations or movement of a body, it's still information that has to be decoded. And it still happens in a slightly differently organized thing we call the brain. The insect brain, especially the honeybee brain, is very different than the human brain by about every way imaginable, other than we have sort of similar cell types that we both call neurons, but they're actually kind of different, okay? So this is where language is derived from simple stimuli, if it's present, right? So we want to decode this dance. And one of the things to really emphasize here is these bees do this dance in total darkness inside of the cavity of the hive. So they never actually see the dance. They can only dance the dance. And the dance is interpreted by a slightly different form of dance. Because the way the dancer is going to move, if you've ever been dancing, one person leads, the other one follows. The following motions are different because they're not facing the same directions, right? For the receiving bee compared to the sender bee, okay? There's a whole bunch of calculus involved. If you guys are interested in that, different talk, okay? So we're gonna open up. I put together some time ago a web app, so to speak. If you go to this website, or if you just search honeybee, Waggle, and my last name, Najera, you should get something that looks like this. And so let's go to the thing. Now, it's built with Adobe Flash, and apparently the internet is like, we're done with Flash, and it's phasing out. So I'm gonna have to redo this. Good thing we got a 4-year IT program or something like that around here. Okay, so what does the dance look like? When I built this, I was in Texas. So not the Texas 2-step, but a Texas 4-step. It is a 4-part behavior. And again, contrast to how we think about human language. It's more than a 4-part behavior, but ultimately it's moving vocal cords, right? Moving tongues to project out some sort of information. These are a series of behavioral action patterns meant to push out a dance pattern, a spatial movement that encodes information, okay? So they alternate between waggles, left turns, waggles, right turns, waggles, left turns, waggles, right turns. And it's not 100% perfect left, right, left, right. Sometimes it's waggle left, waggle right. But they don't really seem to care, okay? The most important part is in the waggle component. So what are they doing? It is communication, and we know bees have all sorts of other communications. They communicate specific nectar sources by sharing directly. This information is what you're going to find in the flower. Here, taste it, smell it, okay? But what the waggle dance allows them to do is recruit their sisters to places of interest. And it's important to understand this is not just about food. They're going to use the same signals to communicate totally different objects in reality. Nest sites, water sources, pollen sources, nectar sources at minimum, okay? So we say places of interest rather than one specific thing. And what happens is the bee goes out, finds a bunch of flowers. Let's say they're going to communicate the flower location. Maybe it's a nectar source. And then it says, you know what? This flower is really tasty, a lot of sugar water. So a lot of nectar, right? I can try and go back and forth to home and drink the nectar out of, I don't know, let's say 50 acres of plant. Or I can go back and tell my sisters where the flowers are. And so the recruitment dance, let's just do some simple math. If one bee finds the flower and goes back, does some dances, recruits 4 bees, if those 4 bees then come back and say, wow, this is really good, and they go back and recruit, and each one of them gets 4 bees, now we've got an exponential explosion of bees to a particular place. And this is one of the reasons why they're so powerful in agriculture, because you can literally set out 100,000 acres of almonds, and the bees will communicate which ones are producing nectar and which ones are ready for pollination. And they will literally visit 100,000 acres, which if you know almond trees, you know there's a few hundred blooms on every tree. They will visit every single flower because inside of the hives, there's easily 60 to 100,000 bees. This is better on average than bumblebees because in bumblebee colonies, you'd be lucky to get 100 bumblebees. So if you want to pollinate 100,000 acres, which each of your bushes, your small trees, has 100 or plus, maybe close to 1,000 flowers, this is the way we get it done, okay? Once they get that much resource, they don't consume it immediately. They store it. They store it so that they have resource when the flowers go away. And the processing required to store food in nature is difficult because there's bacteria, there's fungi, there's all kinds of stuff that will grow on your product. When humans try and store their grains, they have all kinds of problems. Rusts get into the mills, mice get into the mills. There's all sorts of things out there. So the bee strategy is to make it a desiccant. They evaporate the water until it's 82% dissolved solids, and then they cap it with wax so that the moisture from the air doesn't get in. And what that means is if there were any bacterial spores or fungal spores present when they cap it, those bacterial spores, fungal spores, are going to get the water sucked out of them, and they're going to die because there's so much sugar in this, for the chemists out there, super saturated solution of sucrose mainly, okay? And specifically, they're doing it to survive when there are no flowers. Now, unlike many insects which go into the ground to hibernate and just wait out the winter, the bees are active, metabolically active. When they're raising brood, doesn't matter what time of year, they're at like 97 degrees Fahrenheit. When it snows, the snow melts faster on the bee colony than anywhere else, okay, because of that heat. So they need that to persist. It is their strategy to be out fast early in the year. They start raising brood before the flowers show up, so that when the flowers show up, they're on top of everything, okay? They're like a bunch of little Smeagol's. You guys familiar with the Lord of the Rings series? Like, they got to get their ring. Like, they just want the flowers, man. And they just got to get the flowers, you know? Like, there's nothing else unless you come attack them, because then there's defense. All right. They communicate a couple different things with this waggle. One of the things is the distance from the hive, their home, to the place of interest. And it is in the waggle component. The rule is relatively simple. So imagine the colony is where they are in this orange box. If you feed them at a particular site that's relatively close to the hive, they dance in a figure-8 pattern. The waggle component is shorter both in distance and in time. So it's actually a complex signal. If you feed them farther away, so food site 1 here is the black dance, food site 2 would be the blue dance. If you feed them farther away, the waggle component elongates, increases its duration across space and in time. So, longer the dance, the farther away the food. But what's really cool is the mathematicians have got a hold of this. The psychophysicists have got a hold of this. If you don't know what psychophysics is, so like there's the real physics in reality, how mass moves, and then psychophysics is how your brain thinks it all works, and it's not the same, okay? So it obeys a psychophysical principle called Fechner's law. It's a logarithmic transformation. As they increase one more step or one more millisecond in their dance, it indicates more and more and more distance in reality, which means in a very small location, you can communicate very logarithmically derived distances. That makes sense? And the world record for the honeybee traveling, because of a waggle dance, is 6 miles for honey. They're not going to do that for flowers, for honey, okay? Down a very straight road. 6 miles for an organism that's barely 2 centimeters long, right? Think about that for a minute. How many of y'all drive to the grocery store? They fly. Flying is difficult. Energetically very difficult. Okay, so that's how distance is communicated. And they also communicate direction. So for the mathematicians out, these are polar coordinates, right? R, the distance, theta, and the direction. But theta is meaningless unless you have a reference point, right? You don't know which direction to head unless you've got something you can use. So they also communicate direction in their waggle run. And they use the sun as a directional reference point, which humans automatically say, wait. There's a problem with using the sun as a directional reference point. There's actually 2 problems. What are they? The sun moves. How are you going to use a moving target? But guess what? The sun moves predictably at an angular velocity of 15 degrees per hour, right? Which means in 24 hours, 15 times 24 is 360, 360 degrees in a full circle. And the dance was initially found out this way. Scientific experimentation was looking at angles of the dance, feeding in the exact same place. The dance kept rotating. And a guy by the name of Carl von Frisch says to himself, why are they rotating the dance? The food source is stable. And then he calculated the speed of rotation, 15 degrees per hour, and being a very well-educated person, immediately, that's the same speed, not as the movement of the sun, but as the rotation of the earth, right? So are they in tune with the rotation of the earth? Maybe, I don't know. Different story entirely. Now, there's also a lot of things you can use about the sun. The height, right, off of the horizon. They actually don't use that. They just draw, like, I don't know, conceptually, theoretically, they draw a straight line down to the horizon. That's what they use. It's called the sun's azimuth. That's what the humans have called it. I don't know what the bees call it. But the second problem is you can't always see the sun. And specifically, you can't communicate about the sun in total darkness. So somehow you have to symbolically link your initial point of reference, directional reference, the sun, to some other directional reference in total darkness. So what's a good directional reference in total darkness? Not the moon. What do they tell you if you're trapped in an avalanche and you're not like completely broken? Like what you're supposed to do? Spit. Why? Because gravity pulls it towards the center of the planet and means you dig which way? The other direction. Okay. So bees can detect gravity as well. So they dance, and this is totally arbitrary. This is where that symbolic communication begins to come in, which makes some people interpret this behavior as language. Communication about something, not using the same symbolisms, not using the same derived pieces of information, not using the exact same motions as what you're trying to communicate, okay? And so in total darkness, they use gravity as a reference, but they symbolically represent the sun as the direction opposite of gravity. They didn't have to do that. Totally arbitrary, completely symbolic, right? Of course, we didn't know this at first. And there were a lot of people since Aristotle who had witnessed this dance, and they all blew it because they thought there was no way the honeybee could do it. They're just insects. They didn't have a proper removal of restraints on their concepts, okay? So the symbolic sun is direction opposite of gravity. So here we have an example. Let's say they're in the square in the middle, and the sun is on the horizon on the very end, right at the top. I like to tell people, just think of it as a clock, okay? 12 is up. So the direction of the sun is in the same direction as 12 o'clock. So when they dance, if you feed them at food site 1, which is in the same direction as the sun, when they waggle, they're going to waggle in the same direction as the symbolic sun, which is the direction opposite of gravity, which is up. And if this is confusing you, it's okay, you're not a bee. What's really cool, though, is they don't have to learn this. This is instinctually built in. They don't have to learn how to communicate it, and they don't have to learn how to read it. But there's a learned component because they have to learn where the source is and how to communicate that, right? Specifically learn places of interest. Now, if you're at food site number 2, and the sun is on the horizon there, if the sun is 12 o'clock, what time is food site number 2 relative to the hive? 3 o'clock. So when you dance, you're going to dance at 3 o'clock relative to the symbolic sun, which, if you see the dance for food site number 2, they'll dance 90 degrees clockwise from the symbolic sun. And so this means literally when they're flying, they're keeping in a track in their head where the sun is because they're going to need that information to convey it later. So, again, if it's not sinking in immediately, it's okay, you're not a bee. There's a bunch of human concepts that the bees are like, I'm not a human, who cares, okay? Shakespeare, doesn't matter. We got Shakespeare, bee, you know? So, I built this for students to help understand. You can put the sun anywhere on this landscape's horizon. You can actually put it anywhere you want. It just doesn't make much sense out there. It's a computer, it just follows the rules, right? So let's say we put this here. If we feed them in the same direction as the sun, they will dance which way? Up. Opposite of gravity. And I made sure to put the little indicator of gravity because some of my students would be like, well, you didn't say which way gravity was. Fair enough. Put it in there. Okay? What if we feed them closer? You get a little shorter. Now, you have to trust me that what I program is correct, okay? But guess what we have on campus? Bees. And guess what we can make lots of? Sugar water. And guess what we do once a year? We actually demonstrate this in reality. So the bees fly to specific places. We take little paint pens and we paint them. And when they go back, they're behind glass. You can watch them dance. And so students who don't know where they're being fed get to watch the dances, put it on a map, and we can actually calibrate for the map. and they can figure out where they're dancing. Usually we make them dance near Stay This Hall because it scares everybody in English, you know. Now, if we put the sun over here and we put the food over here, if the sun is 12 o'clock, what time is the flower? 7-ish. So what way are they going to dance? If 12 o'clock is the symbolic sun, at 7:35 or something like that. And they're extremely accurate. Their accuracy is so high, they're inhibited by the shape of the hexagon comb because they can't do a straight line properly. Their joints are not as flexible as ours. They're kind of stuck in a few planes. But if a dancer dances long enough and a bee that's observing the dance gets 7 or 8 repetitions, they can cognitively average them out to get a more accurate signal. And there's a difference between left-hand waggles and right-hand waggles after a left turn or a right turn, which creates what's called a divergence angle between those two. There's some indication that divergence angle actually indicates the size of the patch of flowers out there in the field. Oh, and there's also sound communication going on too, but we won't talk about that. We'll leave sound for another species entirely. Okay, so this is out there in the world. Feel free to play with it. Honestly, it's a little easier to do it this way than to feed the bees and get stung and all that stuff. But this is the secondary understanding. This is the internet world. The reality is out there, okay? Don't put one before the other. Back in the day, they say, well, don't put the horse before the cart before the horse, right? Don't put your own experience, right, behind the fake reality, artificial reality experience. All right, back to our slideshow. Now, that's for the western honeybee, Apis mellifera. There are other species of honeybees, and each one has a slightly different way of interpreting the same exact stimuli. We call these dance dialects, similar to human language dialects, right? People from New York speak a little bit different than people from California, and definitely from Washington, you know? So here we have a graph. There's a billion graphs I could have picked. But the idea is here, these groups of bees are one species. And as you feed them at different distances, their waggle duration increases at that specific rate with these exact values. Is all scientific, right? But a different species does that in a different way. This is a different mathematical conversion. This is where the language is. It's in the conversion of the stimuli to understand a symbolic representation involving two different directional reference sources while simultaneously transposing a vertical dance to a horizontal flying plane. And this research first came out in the 1930s and 40s when the prevailing thought was dogs cannot learn. You can only condition their reflexes. Once this came out, this whole brand new field of science emerges called ethology. Before it was animal behavior, and learning and memory and consciousness were not even close to being concept applied to non-human forms of life. The concepts were pretty restrictive then. And we can't even act like all of our concepts today are not restrictive. We are loosening up, though, a little bit. And then, later in the 70s, 80s, 90s, another group of people were down in South America checking out stingless bees. It's a little easier to work with stingless bees. They don't sting you. They also make a little bit of honey, but not so much that the big companies can sell it. You can sell it in small farm stands and things like that. These bees can communicate, well documented, okay? But they didn't know how initially. So, following a lot of the classic experiments by Carl von Frisch and others, they set up a variety of apparatuses to get this information to be known. And what they discovered was, what these bees do is they just do some random jig just to get attention, okay? They make activity happen. It's sort of random. There's no real pattern to it. And trust me, they looked hard for patterns because they assumed it would be similar to the motion language, right, of the honeybees. But this is actually sound language. So, the stingless bees, There's, I don't know, 4,000 to 6,000 species of stingless bees in the tribe Meliponini, mostly of the two genera Trigona and Melipona. The apis, which are the honeybees, there's like 10 species. So not a lot of variety. But in 4,000 to 6,000 species, they haven't done them all. And there's going to be all sorts of gradation, all sorts of dialects, all sorts of difference. Okay? How many human languages have there been? 7,000 to 9,000, something like that. Maybe the insects have more forms of language. We don't know. If you're willing to call this language. And there are still reasons to be rigid, okay? But there are also reasons to be a little more flexible. So, stingless bees. If there's food, now these exist in the tropical rainforest, mainly. If there's food at the top of the canopy, which is pretty high sometimes, and if you know anything about tropical rainforest, there's lots of levels of canopy with different species at different levels. If it's high, these are the types of sounds they make. If it's relatively low, these are the kinds of sounds they make. So they can communicate height within a tree. And where the honeybees dance was like motion, and that means flying, it's kind of like those are sort of similar. But this is sound to communicate motion. So not only is it symbolic, the modality is different entirely. And then distance, 50 meters, 150 meters, 360 meters, you pulse it out, if it's close, and you hold those notes the farther it is. Now, I haven't spent the time to build the Adobe Flash thing for this yet because it's going to phase out anyway. I'm going to have to learn a whole new language of computer programming to convey other languages of other... Man, can't we all just get along with the same language? So, comparing these languages, honeybees use motion to convey distance and direction information. They do not communicate height. And they did some really simple experiments. Radio tower, right? You're like pulling up the sugar water. It takes them forever to figure out its way up there, unless you train them individually, incrementally. But if you just do one down at the bottom and you do one up 100 meters or something weird, like, they're never going to find it. They can't communicate that. To be honest, though, how much can you communicate with dancing? You can actually do quite a bit, but not a lot of detail, right? You can convey whether you're interested in someone or not, right? Stingless bees, with sound, communicate distance and height, but not direction. So they use odor trails on the vegetation to tell the other bees, head in this direction and follow the sounds that you hear. It's vibration in the air, yeah. So sound production, right? The movement of the vocal cords is different than sound vibration in the air. From their wings, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So they leave little odor trails, and what's really crazy is because there's so many species and because other species could potentially smell their odor trails, there's like, they could be spies out there, right? It's like you gotta keep your signals down because otherwise they're gonna be listening. They're gonna find your food, right? And then it's all of a sudden a competition game. So what they've done, a lot of these species, is there's just a few scent drops by the hive that say, go in this direction, and then there's nothing so that they can't be spied on. And what's really crazy, because there's so many species, they've been starting to look at this. Different species, depending on if they have 5 other species living in their area or 50 other species, their signals elongate or shorten relative to the amount of potential competition. And so the evolutionary story behind this is dramatic. Now, I also have to tell you the evolutionary story behind the honeybees. Some of the honeybees are not cavity nesting. They actually nest in open trees on branches. And when they dance, it's on a relatively flat surface where they can see the sun. So initially, a dance in the direction means fly in that direction. But once some of them became cavity nesting bees, they had to reinvent a whole nother way to symbolically link and transpose those circumstances, which is just fabulous if you think about it. So there's a few thousand more species to investigate. Stay tuned. I'm not doing that research, but this is just a picture of some backyard bees you may find in North America. And to be honest, the amount of diversity of bees in North America is low compared to in the tropics. That's where they really get going because there's no winter, right? There's flowers all year round. There's no worry to hibernate. You know? Yeah, totally. So let's return back. Language, bees, motion, sound, vocal cords. All words are made up, okay? What we have are brains that try and understand and conceptualize. And concepts can be rigid or they can be loose. As you, mostly students, I know some of the older people may have made their minds up, about the world in certain ways. Are the concepts that these words are trying to convey, are they restrictive or are they inclusive? And this gets to the more worldly idea of what the bees can teach us. Because if we think that the bees are dumb, if we think that the bees have no capabilities, if we couldn't learn something from the bees, then yeah, they're going to be useless. But if we open our minds to say, maybe we don't know everything, and the ability to talk about Facebook and Instagram, like, what does that give us? What does it really give us? What are the things we really need to be communicating about when it comes to a worldly perspective? Could we learn something from the bees? Do these words help us understand our world? When you, as an individual, have to hold two opposing thoughts in your head, sometimes this is very difficult. This is very challenging because guess what? The world can sometimes seem to contradict itself. Although some philosopher would say, the world never contradicts itself. It's your interpretations are what contradict, right? Of course, that's a philosophical thing. We're not 100% sure on either case. But if this ever comes to be, why? Why focus on the conflict? Focus on consolidation. Focus on resolution. Why focus on the difference? Instead, focus on the similarity. One of my heroes is Joseph Campbell, famous teacher guy, mythological kind of dude, cultural person. And he was the guy that was like, you know what? Yeah, these cultures are different, but I want to see the similarity. What is the human story? What is the story that's being told in every single culture, right? And what are the different ways it's being told? And I think we would do better sometimes focusing on that similarity. Unify the knowledge. Unify the understanding. And when you start doing this, why communicate at all? What's going to be selective for better and better communication? What is really the purpose of language? We can communicate whatever we want. We can add more and more concepts. And I know you guys as students are like, there's so many things to remember. And I just got done doing chemistry. And so it's like, okay, this molecule has all these things. And if you change this one thing, totally different name. You change this, totally different name. We get it. There's new concepts, new words for all the new things. But there are some basics that I think humanity at this point is trying to forget almost about the world, about the shared resource, about the common ground across humanity and across all these other species. Now, this series is titled Global Talks and aptly named because there really is no talk that isn't global at this point. And we have to start thinking, not just how we talk, because what we do when we talk is behave. How we interpret our behaviors, how we choose our behaviors, how we make our presence on this planet. There is no action that isn't felt by others. And in some strange way, this is sort of a language, how we act, how it's interpreted by the ecosystems around us, how it's interpreted by other humans, how it's interpreted by other species. There is no self. You are not isolated. There's no way to conceptualize you as an isolated piece of life. All of you were the union of two people, not one person, right? And you, in every single breath you take, are fully dependent on a photosynthetic organism. If you want to act isolated, stop breathing, right? You got 8 to 20 minutes if you can hold it, if you trained yourself. This is a system of connection. This is a system of interaction. It isn't about me, 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 me. It's about we. Everything is global at this point. And to be honest, it always has been. Understanding that, making sure our concepts reveal that in everyday language, in every single word, in every interpretation of animals' behaviors. This is what we mean when we talk about inclusiveness, full inclusiveness. I teach environmental science, and we say, we realize you think you're important. When you're born, you have a real good concept. I need stuff. You come out the womb, and until you're satisfied, you really don't stop. And you train your parents very well to respond to your needs. But at some point, and then for the younger people in the room, if you haven't done this yet, do it. At some point, you got to come to grips with, if it wasn't for your parents or your caregiver early in your life, you wouldn't be here. Stop and tell them thank you. You should be thankful, and it will melt their heart completely. This is another global language. But guess what? It isn't just your parents, because there's family members that help out, right? There's the rest of humanity. Did you make your own shoes? Did you make the car you drive, right? You are dependent in so many ways. And that's just focused on the human side of things. Now, the one thing I sort of dislike about this picture is they decided to put sentient animals in here. And you know, whether or not an animal is sentient or not, I think they all deserve some respect. Because the way nutrients have to cycle in order for the soil to produce crops that we eat, all of them are relevant. And because an ant can't tell us that it feels, doesn't mean necessarily that it should be lower on the scale of moral consideration. You are all of these things. You are a result of the interactions. Everything is global. All of life and the non-living things. We must open our concepts to understanding that balance. Because literally nothing else is keeping us alive. Every breath you take, it's a gift. If you think about it from the plant's perspective, it's actually a donation. They could have used some of that oxygen. They have the ability to use oxygen to break down sugar. They can do that, right? But they want your carbon dioxide too, so it's a little bit of investment too. You take care of me, I take care of you. And we know across the planet, especially in this country, we haven't been taking care of things very well. So we have to learn. And how do you learn? Good old example. Young kid wakes up early one morning, stove is on, sees this beautiful red hot iron, says to itself, I wonder how hot that thing is. Curiosity, Maybe it asks the parent. What does the parent say? How hot is it? I don't know. Don't touch it. That's a very functional understanding, right? If they ask a scientist, the scientist may say, well, it's roughly 200 degrees Celsius, but it depends on the current applied, the material, and at that point, the child is like, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. It makes no sense, unless you're a scientist. But if you really want to know, you do touch it, right? You have to experience. This is the power of experience. You've got to understand that your struggle as a living organism is the same as every other living organism's struggle. You wake up, you don't know what's coming today. You can never be certain. But you better be thankful that there are still plants out there, because every breath you take is because of them. This is something we have to learn. Another old saying, you got to take time to smell the roses. Not on Minecraft, like in reality, right? Because those roses are part of that system. That whole system is called nature. And you aren't just a part of it. You are nature. You're an expression of that natural set of rules. You are a natural phenomenon. This leads to the idea of global sustainability. For all the bees and all the languages, there's a simple language. Reduce, reuse, recycle. We forget that those 3 arrows in that symbol actually mean 3 things, not just recycling. And the rules were reduce as much as possible, embrace the sacrifice. Reuse if you accidentally produce too much, and recycle if you can't reduce or reuse. And when these rules are applied, we can have the futures that we want. The sustainable futures, the one where there is no energy problem, where there are no poison rivers. Guess what? The bees, the bees are already in. They're 100% in. Are you? That's the language we have to learn. That's what we need to understand when we see behavior. And when we decide to use language, make sure that our concepts are embracing everything that we depend on, which is everything. That's what sustainability means, okay? The bees say it. It's a little weird. They dance. They make little piping noises, and we can say it too. So, given that, glad you came to talk, glad you came to listen, and hopefully you have a slightly different understanding, I won't say better, of what language may be and how to communicate. Oh, and as harvest plug, shameless plug, we are having our honey harvest on October 11th. It's a Friday at noon in SC 243. If you want to see some of the products of the bees, or if you ever want to come out and have a tour, we will make sure you get all that you can handle. Any questions? Yeah.
When is this clear enough? Okay. When you were talking about different bee species have different languages for the waggle dance, is that different bees in the apis, or does that include like bombus and what? How does that work?
So when I'm talking about the dialects within honeybees, it's all the genus Apis. So Bombus does not do this. So just Apis does the waggle communication. Bombus does not have a recruitment dance of any sort like this. Yeah, they have all kinds of other communication, but nothing that we would consider symbolic in nature, right? The way that the sound communication is communicating movements, or the way that there's transposition of planes and different orientation, the sun and gravity. Nothing like that. Nothing in that symbolic sort of range. It's more gestural. It could be all imitated, right? That sort of stuff. Okay. Anything else?
So this doesn't relate to their language, but more to the interconnectedness. What's the best thing that we can do to help preserve or increase the honeybee population? Because I understand it's at risk, especially in our area.
Well, specifically for honeybees, there's 2 perspectives. The local perspective in terms of recent phenomenon. You're right. The number of honeybee colonies has dropped. So what people are saying right now is, if you want to be a beekeeper, that obviously helps. But that's a lot of work and stuff. It's another thing to do, right? But the next would be, whatever you do should benefit the bees and the rest of the ecosystem, right? Don't isolate. So plant native flowers. That's the key. So there's plenty of native flowers. There's actually quite a bit of native nurseries in our part of the world. Other parts of the world, native nurseries are kind of hard to come by. So lots of things. And we live in such a lush ecosystem that a lot of our native plants you could plant are also going to give you like berries. So there's also a human side to that you could take. Now, the more global perspective is the recognition that in the New World, both North and South America, honeybees are not native. So the fact that we used to have more bees, now that they're dropping off a little bit, some people would say it's going back to normal, right? They should be at 0. Of course, our agricultural system is completely invested at this point, and what that would mean for the rest of society, we're not prepared for, okay? So it's tough. And one of the things the honeybee does is it really forces humans to grapple with the contradictions sometimes that we put ourselves in these scenarios where we're using things that are not part of the ecosystem to industrially manage ecosystems, right? You think of what pollination is, and those hundreds of thousands of acres of crop field, that's the industrialization of a natural process, right? And there's no indication, based upon what we've seen, that that's going to be sustainable. And if you think of monocultural crop farming, it's one of the least sustainable farming practices on the planet. Okay? And you could even go as far to say it wouldn't be as strong as it is now, the monocultural crop farming, if it wasn't for honeybees in the new world. Does that make sense? And what's really crazy to think about, we're pulling so much nutrient out of the soil making our crops, the nutrients in the soil is starting to drop off and become very problematic. Soil is so vital to so many things, and if you add up all the money, it's worth more than anything else. All the crops are nothing without healthy soil, and honeybees are responsible in a large part to rip those nutrients out with all that extra pollination. Because the plant, once it gets pollinated, it's like, all right, got to dig up a whole bunch more nutrients, got to do the reproduction thing. But now we were so invested in monocultural crop farming that we do it with crops that don't need bee pollination. And if you guys have heard something along the lines of, oh, bees are responsible for, so much percent of your food, it's true, but the types of food that bees give us don't keep human populations alive. The things that provide us the most nutrients across the world are pretty much grasses, and they're wind pollinated. We don't even need bees. So what are the three major crops of the world? Wheat, corn, and rice. You don't need bees for that. So yeah, if the bees all went away, it would change, but we would still be okay. You just wouldn't be able to have pineapple and raspberries and strawberry, the delicacies. But it wouldn't take us away from actually being able to sustain ourselves in nourishment. I think the statistics in the United States are 1/3 of every piece of food you eat is directly related to honeybee pollination. Last I heard, in the United States, we could probably cut 1/3 out the diet. And I mean that jokingly, but at the same time, not. We can do with less. Part of why we're where we are is because we're choosing not to do with less, right? And it's that dilemma where, the mother bird has 5 eggs, but she can only support 3. We're like, we're going to get 5. We're going to add another 6, and whoever else has to go away because of that, we're doing it. Lock, stock, and barrel, right? We're not embracing that sacrifice of reduce, right? One of those arrows in that symbol. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
Am I doing okay? Okay. Is that Waggle? Is this all hardwired into bee brains? Or is there any, I have to learn to interpret that part on the part of the bees?
Yeah, so people have done study where you ask that question. Is there a learned component? The answer is, for the mechanics of the dancing, they do not require any prior experience. So you keep a bee in isolation so that it never listens to a dance, and then it forages all by itself. It can come back and dance immediately. The first time it listens to a dance, you can make sure it never danced before. There's ways to just track these Germans, man. Much love. They mark every single bee in the colony with a numerical tag, and they number, blue 35 this is 3 months of its behaviors. I mean, it's just a fascinating level of detail. If they've never danced, they can interpret a dance. They do not have to learn. There is some understanding. A recent paper was published, I think in 99 or maybe 2009, something 9, where they put mixed colonies with different dialects. And over time, they got a little bit better. It was statistically significant, and it was close enough, but it wasn't as good as the normal stuff. So there's a little bit, but it's more hardwired than not, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Which to me, it's just phenomenal, because if you think about the level of organization from a DNA sequence all the way up through all that complexity, to get this out of it is just fabulous. Fabulous. Not just behavior,
So I have a question. So I teach language here, teach Spanish, and have studied linguistics and language. And we studied when I was in college Noam Chomsky and the black box. It overlaps. So the disciplines overlap. That's one of the reasons why the global talks, I wanted to bring global talks out because our disciplines don't stay in silos. They well overlap. So the human vocal cords and the human brain have made it so that human beings can just automatically produce language. Like there's a debate out there. Are humans biologically set to produce language? Like, are we like the bees? Is it an instinct? Or is it a learned behavior? And there are a couple of examples, like some little kids that have been separated from their parents or like abused, but they're not sure if that's brain trauma or if it's that has interrupted their instinctual ability to speak, or if they're not, what do you call that? I was thinking in Spanish. If they're not, what do you call that? Something to stimuli? What do you call that? Exposed. If they're not exposed to stimuli, if they will never use the language or use their physical apparatus. So it's really interesting. And then I had another thought about like early cave humans, like in the north of Spain and the south of France, where when there were more animals than humans and people lived in caves, they had cave communication where they would put their hands and then they would paint deer and buffalo, and you can only go in there now, and lions and mammoths, and you can go in there and observe what these humans painted 20,000 years ago, and no one knows what they were trying to communicate, but it's shared amongst the caves, and it just reminds me of the bees. Like, we're trying to interpret what they were saying or what they're saying to each other, and you have been able to decipher it, but the early humans are less understood, I think, than the bees. So
So I'm presenting this waggle dance information as if it was just accepted, and it was not just accepted in the scientific community. There's actually a small book that's been written about the controversy surrounding this, of whether bees can actually do this, whether you call it language or not, right? That's just a label. What they're doing is phenomenal, right? For even a vertebrate, right? We don't even have examples of this in other forms of life, that kind of symbolic level of communication. And so for the longest time, people were like, well, how do you know they're not using odor cues or something else? And it wasn't until like 50 years later that we had the technology to put a little harmonic radar on the back of a bee, okay? Get it all trained up in one area, fly it across the country to a place it had never been where those flowers do not exist, and track it on radar to prove it went this direction and this distance. So the scientific endeavor and the scientific process in this has been very anti, right? And it just, but that's how science works. You got to be like, man, you got to knock out every possible other explanation. And all of the naysayers finally, as of like 2012, okay, are finally like, okay, so it's right. Next, and they just move on. They just move on. That's how we do it, I guess. But a side note is, I'm definitely a little biased because my mentor's mentor was Carl von Frisch, who did the initial studies. And so I got that heavy doses. And I'm looking at all the naysayers is like, okay, they must be wrong. They must be wrong. And my mentor is about slapping me like, no, just look at the data. But you're human, right, at some level. So it's really impressive if you actually track this over time, the different types of experiments to look at the same exact behavior to prove not that it's language, but the actual things that are going on. And what's really amazing is when you say that about early human writings, people have seen waggle dances for a long time. The first human writing we have about it is from Aristotle. And his explanation was they were happy. They found food, they're happy, and they just started dancing. And Carl von Frisch was like, stimulus, evolution. Let's see if there's something to this happiness. And he just started measuring everything, right? And it's just one of those things where there's nothing wrong with the explanation that they're happy. They probably are happy. They just found this massive resource they're going back to dance about. But sometimes there's more to it, right? And we have to, like I said at the beginning, we have to make our concepts fluid enough that we don't restrict ourselves, okay? And part of the last bit of the talk with the global awareness and the ecosystem sustainability, that openness means the concepts have to be reflective, right? We have to obey as well as command. And then once we do that, there's no difference of obey and command. It's just one thing. And everyone can clean their own front yard, and the whole world will be clean, right? It's that simple. It is literally that simple, okay? And again, the bees are all in. Every sunny hour of every day, they're doing the nature stuff. They're not worried about Netflixing and chilling, okay? And I use these terms because those are the new terms for the students these days. So sorry for you people older than 25, if you want to admit it. Anything else? All right, well, thank you for the time. If you want to spare me 1 second, we're going to take a spherical picture. We'll take everything. I'm getting in the habit of doing this. And if you don't want to be in it, just kind of hide, because it gets everything, all right? It's going to count down 5 seconds. Global talks. Cool. Thank you very much for coming. It is 2:30, so go on about your business and smile at a bee today, because they are out in these last few days of warmness. Thanks.